He cut down her champion in one swing now. Alien law binds her to serve him. HFY Sci-Fi *. The sky over Valona Prime was red with smoke and banners flying from the tall towers of the royal city, as people filled the arena for the trial of strength, where one human stood alone on the sand, surrounded by thousands of aliens who came to see him die, and above them all sat Princess Shali, with her silver crown and cold eyes, watching the human with no interest in her heart. He was small compared to her champion, a beast of muscle and armor named Cthulhu, who had never lost a fight and never taken mercy, and the crowd cheered his name like thunder rolling across the stone walls. And yet the human stood still, his hands behind his back, his face calm with old scars and quiet eyes that held no fear. Shali looked down and spoke to the high voice of law beside her, and asked why they had allowed this human to choose trial by combat, and the high voice replied with a quiet smile that the ancient law allowed any visitor who spilled royal blood by accident to fight for his life if he wished. And this one had spilled her cousin's wine and refused to kneel, so the horns blew and Cthulhu stepped forward with a warhammer heavier than most beasts, and he roared and pointed at the human, and the crowd laughed because they believed it would end in seconds. But the human did not flinch, and he did not step back, and when Cthulhu charged, the ground shook and the air trembled, but the human waited, and then at the last moment, moved like wind, twisting under the blow, and drawing a short blade from behind his belt. One clit was all it took. The crowd gasped, and silence followed. Cthulhu stood frozen, with eyes wide, and then fell as his body split open from shoulder to hip, with blood soaking the arena floor, and the warhammer crashing beside him with a final thud. The crowd was silent, the wind stopped, the banners hung still, and Shali stood from her throne with her mouth open, and her fingers gripping the edge of her seat, as the high voice of law raised his staff, and spoke. The law of strength is clear, he said. When a royal champion is defeated by one outside the bloodline, the victor may claim the hand and service of the royal who sent him. Shali shook her head, and whispered that this was madness, but the high voice reminded her that her own seal had placed Cthulhu in the circle, and so the law was binding. The human wiped his blade, and looked up toward her throne, and his voice was calm and clear as he said, I do not want a slave, and I do not want a servant, but I will accept the law if that is what your world demands. Shali turned to the council, but none would defy the ancient rule, for the law had stood longer than empires, and it had been carved into the stone tablets, that even she could not change. So she sat slowly, her breath heavy, and her hands cold as the crowd began to murmur, and the whispers spread through every level of the city. The human's name was Cole, and his past was unknown, but now he was bonded to the royal house of Valona, and by law, Shali and her handmaidens would serve him until death, or until he released them himself in the shadows of the high balconies. Eyes watched with hate and fear, for this single act had changed everything. The alien people had mocked humans for years, seeing them as weak and soft and slow, but today one had cut down the strongest of their warriors with a single move, and claimed a royal not with chains of cruelty but with honor, and the blade. The arena slowly emptied, and Cole was led through the stone halls to the royal chambers by guards who kept their distance, unsure if he was man or monster, and Princess Shali followed with fire in her heart and fury in her steps, knowing that though the law was ancient and binding, her pride would not make this easy. She whispered to her closest maid that the human may have won the duel, but he would never win her will, and that she would never kneel, not for him, not for any human. But the maid saw something different in her eyes. Not just anger, but something else she could not name. Cole sat alone in the chamber offered to him by the court, and stared at the stars through the high window above his bed, and thought about the moment his blade moved, and the sound of the champion falling, and the voice of the law sealing his fate. Outside, the door guards stood silent, and beyond them the whispers grew louder. The duel had changed more than the fate of one man. It had shaken a world built on strength and pride, and started something that could not be undone. And in the heart of Princess Shali, a storm began to grow. The doors to the royal court opened wide, and Princess Shali walked in, with her head high, her eyes cold, and her voice sharp, as she demanded the high voice of law to reverse the ruling from the duel, because it was wrong, and because she was not meant to be given away like some object. But the council only looked at her in silence, and the high voice lifted his staff, and said the law was written before her birth, and before her mother's birth, and that no royal blood could change it now. She looked at Cole, who stood in the corner with his arms crossed, and his face calm, not speaking a word, as the council argued about tradition, honor, and fate. But he never interrupted, and never raised his voice, and she hated that the most, because he did not act like a man who won a prize, or like someone who wanted power. Fingers tightened at her side, and she said the law may bind her, but her heart would never yield. and that if the human thought he could make her serve, he would soon learn that a crown does not bend. The high voice reminded her that resistance would only bring shame to her name, and dishonor to her house, and the law required her to perform the first rites within the next cycle, before the twin moons rose again, or the bond would be forced by old magic, and the pain would be shared between both. She stormed out of the hall with her handmaidens behind her and her long cloak, dragging across the smooth stone floors, as the guards watched in silence, and whispers followed her like shadows, and her own people began to wonder if their princess had already lost more than just a jewel. Cole was given a guest wing near the center tower, where royal guests once stayed, but he asked for something smaller, something away from the gold and velvet halls, and instead he was given a quiet chamber overlooking the gardens with stone walls and no crown symbols, and he spent his time walking the gardens and watching the sky, as if looking for something far beyond this world. The handmaidens were confused because the human had not called for service, had not demanded meals or clothes or any comfort, and even when one brave maid brought him a gift from Shali's collection, he gently refused and thanked her, and told her she did not need to serve him, unless she wished. Word spread quickly, and some said the human was broken in the mind, while others began to whisper that he might be something more, and a few even started to believe he could bring change. Where old blood had only brought fear, Princess Shali sat in her chamber staring at her reflection in the mirror, not touching her food, not speaking to her maids, and not wearing her crown. And when one of the elders arrived and told her to prepare for the first rites, she threw her goblet at the wall and shouted that she would rather fall from the tower than kneel to a man from a broken world. That night she went to the temple alone and stood before the statue of the first queen, who had written the law of strength, and asked why the old laws were so cruel, and why she must give herself to someone who had taken her honor in front of all her people. And the wind that passed through the temple carried no answer, only sabotage outside the city gates. A dark figure moved through the shadows, holding a blade coated with dust from the fire. Lance and he passed through the alleys, with no sound, heading for the guest chambers, with eyes full of hate and orders given by one of the rival houses, who feared what the human might become if he stayed alive inside the garden. Cole sat with his back to the moonlit sky and heard the soft crunch of steps on the gravel, and he turned slowly, not with fear but with calm, and waited as the shadow moved closer, and the blade was drawn and pointed at his heart. Cole did not move, and when the attacker struck, he stepped aside, grabbed the wrist and twisted it until the blade dropped and the attacker fell to the ground. And Cole looked him in the eye and asked who sent him, but the attacker said nothing, only spat and closed his eyes, waiting for death. Cole picked up the blade and handed it back, and told the man to leave and never return, and that he would not kill someone too afraid to speak. And the attacker fled into the night, shaken by the mercy he did not expect from the window above. Shali had seen everything, and her breath caught in her chest because she had waited for him to kill the man and prove himself a beast, but instead he let him go and walked back into the garden without even looking up. She sat in silence, her thoughts spinning and her hands trembling, because for the first time she felt unsure of the story she had told herself about him. And for the first time she did not know if she wanted to run from the law or try to understand the man who now held her fate. The sky above Valona turned gray with a coming storm, and the wind whispered through the high towers like a warning, and in the quiet corners of the palace, whispers turned to plans, and plans turned to danger, and still the human known as Cole walked through the garden, as if the weight of alien law did not sit heavy on his shoulders, and as if he had not changed the fate of a royal house. With one clean swing of a blade, Princess Shali watched from behind a curtain, her eyes following his every step and her thoughts heavy with confusion. Because she had seen mercy in him where she expected pride and strength, where she expected fear, and she could not understand how a man who now owned her by law could be so calm, so silent, and so willing to stand alone in a palace that hated him. Her handmaidens spoke in low voices, some angry, some scared, and some curious, because none had ever seen a human like this, and none could predict what he would do next. And the old priest who taught them the law said that even the stars had gone quiet since the duel. In the deeper halls of the palace, a door opened in secret, and a young noble from House Jex entered the chamber where the assassin waited, his face hidden under a black hood, and his hands stained with old blood. And the noble gave him a second blade and a promise of gold if he finished what he failed to do the first time. That night, the rain fell in light waves, and the wind pushed through the trees in the royal garden, as Cole stood near the water well, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade, not drawn, and his eyes looking up at the stars that peeked through the clouds like distant eyes watching the world unfold. He heard the steps before he saw the figure, and this time he did not wait for the first strike, but turned and moved fast, catching the arm mid-swing and slamming the attacker against the stone wall, and the blade clattered to the ground as the hood fell back, and the assassin's face showed fear, not of death, but of the eyes that stared back at him. Cole spoke softly, and asked again who sent him, and this time the man answered and named Housejacks, and said they feared the balance would shift if the human remained, and that Princess Shali was just a symbol, not a prize. Cole let the man go again, and told him to run far and never return, and when the guards came, the attacker was gone, and they looked at Cole with wide eyes, because he had every right to kill, yet he spared again. Stepped into the garden, as the guards left, and the rain kissed her hair, and her robe flowed like silver mist, and she walked toward Cole, without speaking, and stood in front of him, without crown, without guards, and without the anger she always wore. Like Amiche asked him why he showed mercy when the law gave him the right to kill, and he said that mercy was not weakness, and that power meant nothing if it was used to destroy and not protect. And she looked at him in silence, and for the first time she saw not a human, but a warrior inside her chest. Something stirred, and it was not fear and not hate, and she turned away quickly, as if his presence burned her skin, and she told him the first rite must happen before the next sunrise, or they would both suffer pain from the law's curse. And he nodded, and said he would be ready, but only if she came by her own will later that night. Shali stood in her chamber, dressed in white with golden bands on her arms, and her maids silent around her, as she looked in the mirror, and whispered to herself that this was not surrender, but duty, and that her honor would remain untouched, even if the law bound her voices. She walked through the palace toward the ancient hall of bonds. Her thoughts swirled like the wind outside, and her steps were slow but steady, and her mind returned again and again to the moment he spared the assassin, and the look in his eyes when he said he wanted no servant. The hall of bonds was lit with soft blue fire, and the high voice stood at the altar, and Cole stood across from it, with a clean robe, and no weapons, and no crown. And when Shali entered the room, the air grew still, as if the old stones themselves were waiting to hear her speak. She stepped forward, and placed her hand on the ancient stone, and spoke the words written in the language of her ancestors, and declared, her voice now tied to the victor, and her house now bound to his will, and her service pledged not in chains, but in honor. Cole stepped forward and touched the stone, and spoke only one word, her name, and the flame turned violet, and the old law was sealed, and the bond was complete. No one spoke as they left the chamber, and the air outside felt different and heavier, as if the world had shifted again. Shali looked at him once before walking away, and her eyes held something new, something not yet spoken, but already growing. The sun rose over the silver towers of Velona, and its light poured into the royal halls with a warm glow that did not reach the cold hearts of those who whispered in corners and watched from the shadows. And in the middle of it all stood Princess Shali, with her face calm and her steps steady, as she prepared for the ancient rite that would mark her obedience to the one who had defeated her champion. Her robes were lighter than usual, and her golden crown was missing, and her maids dressed in silence, their hands gentle, but their faces filled with questions they dared not ask. And Shali looked into the mirror, and saw a woman she did not know. A woman caught between pride and law, between fear and something she could not name. Cole stood alone in the sacred chamber of honor, with a cloak of simple cloth, and no armor, no crown, no sword, and no guards, and he looked around at the walls carved with the names of every royal who had ever bowed in this place, and his hands were steady, and his eyes were quiet and deep like water that had seen storms. The high voice of law stood near the altar, and called for silence as the doors opened, and the princess entered with her head high and her steps soft, and all those who watched held their breath as she crossed the sacred floor and stopped in front of the man who now held her future by Loche. Looked into his eyes and found no hunger, no greed, no cruel joy, only patience and stillness, and it made her voice shake for just a moment before she began the rite that her bloodline had feared. Since the first queen wrote it into stone, I offer my voice to the one who won by strength, she said, and I offer my service by law and by bond, and I will obey the law as my ancestors did. Before me. Cole listened, and said nothing until the high voice nodded, and told him to speak, and he said only that he did not wish for obedience, but for peace, and that if she wished to leave she would be free, and that his honor did not need her Zali's hand trembled, and the watchers whispered, for no one had ever spoken such words in this place. And the flame on the altar flickered, as if unsure what to do, and the high voice paused, but then said the rite was done, and the bond was sealed. And the two were now as one in law, and name after the rite. Shali returned to her chamber, and sat alone, while the city stirred, and the nobles spoke of shame, and confusion, and change, and some began to fear the old ways were cracking, while others saw a new path. In the dust of the past, one of the maids named Vela asked if Shali was angry, and Shali looked at her and said no, and that the human had done nothing wrong, and that the world itself seemed to be turning upside down. And Vela said softly that maybe upside down was where the truth had been hiding all along. Later that day, Charlie walked through the gardens and found Cole sitting near the stone pond, where golden fish swam in quiet circles, and she sat beside him and said nothing for a long time, and neither did he, and the silence felt full, not empty, and the wind played with her hair and the light touched his face, and she saw again the strange stillness that never left his eyes. She asked him what he wanted from all this, and he said only that he wanted no one to be hurt, and that he wanted to learn and to listen, and that he had fought because he had no other choice, and now he was trapped in a story he did not write and did not seek. Charlie looked away and said that her people expected her to hate him and to fight him and to find a way to undo the bond, but she was tired of fighting and tired of pretending, and that for the first time she wanted to choose something for herself and not for a crown. Cole nodded and said choice was the only thing that made service real, and that he would never take what was not freely given, and his voice was low but strong, and it settled into her like a truth she had never heard before. That night a feast was held in the great hall, and the nobles came dressed in silk and steel, and smiles that hid daggers, and they raised their glasses in fake praise, and watched the human and the princess, as they sat side by side and said little, and the tension in the room was sharp as blades. A noble from House Rel stepped forward, and spoke with a voice sweet as honey, and said that he wished to challenge the human for sport in the name of tradition and honor. And Cole stood without fear, and said he would accept any challenge if the law allowed it. And the hall grew silent, as the high voice stepped forward, and said that law allowed it, but warned that the next duel might not be so. Kinchali stood as well, and placed a hand on Cole's shoulder, and said that no more blood would be spilled without cause, and that the next challenge would carry more than bruises. It would carry war, and the nobles looked at her with new eyes, and saw not a bound princess, but a rising storm. The sky above the palace darkened, as clouds rolled in from the edge of the sea, and thunder rumbled like a beast waking from sleep, and in the great hall of Valona, the nobles gathered again, this time not for peace, not for ritual, but for blood. And pride and the old customs stirred once more, as a new challenger stepped forward with fire in his voice and war in his eyes. He was Prince Drell of House Moles, a warrior born of shadow and iron, known across 5 moons for his speed, his rage, and his thirst to break anything that dared shine brighter than him. And he stood before the council, and spoke of honor broken by the human's rise and laws bent by kindness and weakness. The high voice of law asked if the challenge was given in truth, and Drell nodded with a grin, and said it would be clean and final, and that once Cole fell, the bond with Princess Charlie would end, and she would be free to return to her rightful place, and Cole would leave with nothing. Charlie stepped forward, her voice sharp and her eyes bright, and she said no one would decide her place but her, and no one would touch Cole without facing her wrath. And Drell laughed, and said the law allowed one defense, and if the human agreed it would be done. Cole looked at her for a long moment, and then turned to the high voice and gave a single nod, and said he would face Drell at dawn in the arena where it all began. That night the palace was silent, as if holding its breath, and Charlie sat with Cole in the quiet garden where silver leaves drifted in the wind, and she begged him not to fight, and told him that Drell was faster and crueler than Cthulhu, and would not hold back. Cole placed a hand on hers, and said he did not fight for pride or blood, but because he had to, and because if he ran now, the nobles would never stop, and the bond between them would be seen as weakness and not choice, and that he would rather bleed with truth than live with leash. Charlie did not speak after that. She only leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes as the wind moved around them like a lullaby. Without peace at dawn, the arena filled with nobles and warriors and servants and spies, and the air was thick with dust and the tension of many eyes watching. 2 men who stood at the center without armor, only blades in hand and purpose in hard rule, moved first, fast, like a whip striking from the side, and Cole blocked barely in time, and stumbled back, and the crowd gasped, as Drell pressed forward again and again, each blow harder than the last, and Cole's arm shook under the weight, and the ground beneath them scattered with blood. And Charlie watched from above, her nails digging into the stone rail, her heart beating loud in her chest, and her breath shallow, as she whispered his name, again and again like a prayer. Without shape, Cole's blade flew from his hand, as Drell struck hard across his wrist, and he dropped to one knee, and blood ran down his side, but still his eyes held that same calm, that same steady fire that had never once turned to fear. Drell raised his sword to finish it, and screamed that no human would ever rule his people, and as he swung, Cole moved, not with strength but with memory, with purpose, and with the pain of everything he had lost, he caught Drell's arm, turned his weight, and drove the prince's blade into the ground, and pulled his own small dagger from his belt and pressed it to Drell's neck, not deep, not cruel, but enough to freeze the arena in silence. "I do not want your blood," Cole said. "I only want to be left in peace." Drell looked into his eyes, and knew then that he had already lost, long before the duel began. The high voice raised his staff, and declared the fight done, and the bond unbroken, and the choice defended by law and by blood. Surely rushed down the stairs and reached Cole before the guards, and wrapped her arms around him, as the nobles watched in stunned silence, and her tears mixed with the dirt on his face. And she whispered, "You fool, you brave quiet fool," and he smiled through the pain, and said it was worth it. Later, as the healers worked, and the council argued behind closed doors, word of the duel spread across the planet and beyond, and some said the human was not just a warrior, but a symbol of something new and dangerous and beautiful, and that the princess of Veltnar had fallen not by blade, but by heart. In the halls of power some whispered of rebellion, and others of alliance, but in one quiet room, where silver light fell on broken stone, two souls sat side by side, and held hands with nothing between them but the sound of wind, and the promise of what might come. Next asterisk, the council chamber was filled with light from the rising twin suns, and the golden rays touched the silver walls, as if trying to soften the anger inside, but the air remained sharp with tension, and cold with judgment, as the elders of Veltnar sat in a circle, their robes heavy, their eyes harder than stone, and their voices filled with fear and pride and suspicion. Princess Shali stood at the center, her crown resting beside her on the stone table, and her face calmed, though her hands trembled, and she listened as the oldest voice in the room accused her of weakness and betrayal for holding the human's hand before the nobles, and for embracing him after the duel, and for letting her heart interfere with her duty to the bloodline. She said nothing at first, because her words would not matter to ears that were already closed, and her truth would not shake walls built from centuries of silence. But when they demanded an answer, she lifted her head and spoke in a voice clear as crystal and sharp as ice, and she said that love was not weakness, and choice was not shame, and if they feared change, then they feared the very thing that kept life from turning to dust. The high voice of law stood and told her that she had one day to choose between her heart and her crown, and that if she chose the human, she would be stripped of title and land, and cast from the court, and would live as one of the lowborn with no name and no path. Shali returned to her chamber alone, and looked out the window where the gardens swayed gently in the breeze, and Cole sat near the tree where they had first spoken after the rite, and she watched him without moving, and wondered how he remained so calm, while her world cracked like glass under the weight of ancient rules. He looked up and saw her, and gave a small wave, not calling her, not demanding, just being there, just waiting, and her breath caught in her throat, because she realized no one had ever waited for her without wanting something in return. Villa, her closest handmaiden, entered, and asked if she needed help preparing her robes for the next council meeting, but Shali shook her head, and asked her instead what she would choose if she had to give up everything for someone who made her feel seen for the first time, and Vela smiled and said that sometimes the thing worth keeping is not the crown, but the reason you ever wanted one. As the day passed, the palace whispered, and the nobles argued, and the people outside the walls began to gather to hear the princess's choice, for news of her words had spread like fire, and even those who once feared humans now watched with open minds, because the man she stood beside had spilled blood, not for power but for peace. That evening, as the suns touched the horizon and the sky turned gold and violet, the council met one last time, and the chamber was filled with more people than ever before, and every voice went silent as Shali walked in, wearing a simple dress, with no symbols of rank, no golden chains, and no royal colors, and the crown she once wore held gently in her hands. She walked to the center of the room, and placed the crown on the floor, and said that she did not reject her people, but she could no longer wear something that stood between her truth and her future, and that she would not be ruled by fear of tradition, and would not raise a sword against love disguised as duty. The silence that followed was long and heavy, and then the high voice stepped forward, and asked her if she understood what this meant, and if her choice was final, and she looked at Cole, who stood at the edge of the crowd, and nodded once, and then turned back and said, yes. The crown was lifted by the high voice, and placed on the altar of judgment, and Shali stepped away from the center as voices rose in shock and anger and disbelief, but others began to clap and cheer, and a wave of support moved through the room like wind through fire, and in that moment a line was drawn, not just between old and new, but between what was feared and what was possible. Cole stepped beside her, and took her hand and whispered that he would never ask her to choose, and she smiled through tears and said that is why the choice was easy, and the world outside the chamber changed as news reached every tower, and every house and every corner of the cinder. Bond that began with blood had turned to something far stronger, and now the daughter of Valona walked without a crown, but not without purpose, and the man from Earth walked beside her, not as a conqueror, not as a prize, but as a partner. And far beyond the walls of the city, ships began to move in secret, and messages were sent through dark channels, and the enemies of peace began to gather for war. The sky above Valona was dark with ships from rival houses that hovered like silent beasts ready to strike. And the wind that once danced through the royal gardens now carried the scent of fire and metal and fear, and in the middle of this storm stood a princess without a crown, and a human without a throne, but both stood tall, like pillars against the rising wave-coal. Stood at the outer wall of the capital, with armor made from old plates and pieces, shaped by his own hands, and behind him stood a group of loyal guards and warriors, trained not for court but for truth, and beside him walked Charlie, no longer a royal in name, but a leader in heart, and those who followed her did so by choice, not by law. Across the stars, the leaders of House Malls and House Jex and others who once bowed only to tradition, now sent fleets and soldiers to crush the new Bond that had shaken the balance of power, and to remind all who watched that love could not rewrite the old ways, and that no human could rise above the bloodline of the stars. The council had fallen into silence and fear, and many of the nobles had fled to their moons and palaces, but the people remained, and some joined Charlie and Cole with weapons in hand, and eyes wide with hope, and others stayed hidden behind closed doors waiting to see who would rise from the ashes. First attack came without warning, as fire fell from the sky and shook the walls and lit the towers, and screams echoed through the streets as shadows moved between the buildings, and Cole led his fighters through the smoke, not with orders, but with courage, and he fought like wind and thunder, and never let his blade fall, without purposefully moved beside him, with her own sword carved from crystal, and her voice rose like song across the battlefield. And when the people saw her, they remembered that strength could shine without gold, and that power could rise from the heart, not just from a throne. The fighting lasted for days, and the sky never cleared, and the fires never stopped, and the ground became stained with sacrifice and choice and pain. And yet through it all, the bond between the human and the princess did not break. It grew stronger with every breath and every heartbeat and every cry for peace that rose from the broken streets. In the final battle, the enemies brought their strongest warriors and their darkest machines, and for a moment it seemed like the city would fall and the bond would be lost to flames and blood. But Cole stood on the central tower with his body broken and his voice strong, and he raised the flag of Valona in one hand and his sword in the other, and shouted that they could take his life, but they could not take what he had given. Reached him just as the enemy breached the wall, and she stood before him with arms out, and dared them to strike her first, and said that if they wanted to kill the bond, they would have to kill her too. And in that moment, the wind shifted, and something ancient moved in the stars. The people rose again with new fire in their eyes, and those who had hidden came forward, and those who had doubted found courage, and together they pushed back the darkness, not with perfect weapons, but with hearts that refused to yield. And the enemy forces began to fall, not from fear, but from the truth that had taken root in the fire. When the last ship fell from the sky, and the last blade was lowered, the city was quiet again, but it was not the same, and the people were not the same, and the name of the human who cut down a champion, and won a heart, and stood against an empire, was spoken not with mockery, but with pride. Cole stood with Charlie at the edge of the city walls, looking out over the land they had saved, and she took his hand and whispered that the storm had passed, and he smiled and said that more storms would come, but they would face them together. And they watched the sky as the stars began to shine again. One by one, the council was rebuilt, not with the old blood, but with voices from every part of the land, and the law was rewritten, not with chains, but with choice, and the bond that had once been forced by a duel was now remembered as the spark that lit the fire of change. In the years that followed, songs were sung about the human who chose mercy over power, and the princess who gave up her crown to find herself, and their names were carved into the stone of the Great Hall, not as rulers, not as legends, but as the ones who showed that love could rise from war, and that peace could be forged from the sharpest blade. And in the heart of Valona, where the garden grew once more, two chairs stood side by side, beneath the silver tree, and every morning without fail, the human and the princess sat there together, with no need for titles, no need for law, only the quiet joy of what they had built from the ashes.